So good morning, and renewed thanks to Levon Hood for that beautiful introduction. Thank you to VP Stephanie Simpson for the invitation. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for everything that you are doing here to move us forward on achieving and sustaining equity in employment. I am more than delighted to be here today, not only because I'm a Queen's alumna, but also because of how important Queen's Equity, Human Rights and Equity Office's contributions were to the work of the Employment Equity Report. We received one of the only submissions from a university in Canada, from Queen's, and it helped to shape the direction of some of the recommendations that I'm going to talk to you about today. That ability to share was not quite something I could do at CAPD in Calgary in October, because although the report had been submitted to government in April, it was only in December that the report was released. So in CAPD, we had a little bit of a dance around, here's sort of what this might look like and sort of what the landscape is. And so today I'm delighted to have an opportunity to share about the report and its framework and where I think we should be going in relation to equity, in particular in higher education. This issue could not matter more to higher education in this moment. So the framework in place is called a transformative framework to attaining or achieving and sustaining employment equity. The framing around transformation is meant to convey the urgency of employment equity in the Canadian context in this moment. We've gotten used to employment equity. It's been around since the Adelle Commission in 1984 and the first set of legislation in 1986. And we've gotten used to talking about employment equity in terms of the numbers, in terms of the reports that might or might not ever be read. Certainly reports that might or might not ever be audited. And we'll talk a little more about what the architecture looks like in the federal context. The reducing of a framework that is meant to change the way it looks and feels to enter a workplace, that's meant to change the way it looks and feels to be Canadian. The reducing of that to numbers crunching has taken us away from what we should be doing purposefully, carefully, and with a sense of conviction, yes, conviction, about the kind of society we want to be living in. So I think employment equity is central. It really matters. And educational institutions could hardly be more important. And so the framework that's been put in place through our initial understanding of employment equity as substantive equality, and I'll take us through that, and then the framework that is proposed in this report seeks to return us to a place where we're actually engaging with what it takes to achieve and this sustain employment equity. Through the process, the report basically looked at almost 40 years of implementation of employment equity, 40 years of federal institutions, public sector, of course, crown corporations, a range of other federally regulated employment contexts, and those covered by the Federal Contractors Program, which is how our universities and colleges and other actors that would normally be provincially regulated get covered by the employment equity legislative framework, and had an opportunity to see what non-compliance and compliance started to look like. And what was striking was to see at once the numbers crunching in and out in different workplaces, and on the other hand, a range of measures put in place under the banner of EDI that may or may not have been tied to actually achieving, not to mention sustaining, employment equity. And I say this with concern because we know the importance of this moment. We know the depth of the challenge to equity initiatives. And I say this out of a concern that what we do on equity needs to be done with really clear purpose, right? The purpose of actually achieving employment equity, the purpose of being able to say that equitable workplaces actually can and must be achieved. And so how do we do that? We do that through transformative approaches. I'm going to mention one specificity about the Act that will give you a sense of why I came out of the consultations, and we did hundreds of consultations. We received over 400 written submissions as well. The legislation for the past 37 years has been interpreted as if employers should make reasonable progress to achieve employment equity, but that there is no actual legal requirement. Wait a minute. So a combination of Section 5 and Section 11, for those of you who want to kind of look at it, Section 11 basically says if implemented, the plans that employers put in place would constitute reasonable progress. And so kind of looking at this kind of lots of actions, not necessarily focused on actually achieving employment equity, lots of numbers crunching, but not actual attention on what's happening to the people in the workplace contexts where they're located, and in particular, not enough attention to retention. And then how to look at the French version of the same legislation and realized it's really clear. There actually is a clear requirement to implement, right, to achieve employment equity. And so part of this was, what does it take to look at a framework that's become so caught in actions that are non-performative? How do we move this into being the kind of framework it was intended to be? And you'll see here that there is a three-part framework that we proposed for an administrative framework that was largely broken. Along the way, and you'll see that there is, especially in the third chapter of the report, a strong emphasis on our histories, right? On retaining attention to why it is that we have deep levels of underrepresentation still in our workplaces. This work only resonates to the extent that we focus on what has changed between the way that we conceived, in particular, of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada in 1984, and where we are now post-Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and most importantly, post-Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with the international landscape of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as overarching and very much guiding this movement. This work has forced Canada to engage with, acknowledge, and reconcile with its history. And to do this in a way that puts truth about that history first. And without that hard work of acknowledging a history of settler colonialism and engaging with it, we don't move forward. And so doing this review in this moment and taking into account that history and then the claims necessary through an acknowledgement of the full nature of Aboriginal rights, of treaty rights, of Indigenous rights, that framework guided the way that the reform recommendations moved. And one of the crucial elements of that was to be thinking, of course, in a distinctions-based manner about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, but also thinking about how employment relates to broader goals of economic self-determination, right? And so really broadening and rethinking the paradigm of relationship. In relation to that, and there's a thorough discussion of this in the report that I'm happy to take comments and questions on, there's attention, of course, to the pernicious issue of self-identification, since the employment equity framework is or has been premised on a logic of self-identification. And it was incredibly powerful and troubling at the same time to meet with a broad range of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit employees, largely in the federal public service, who would at once explain the challenges that would arise when they self-identified and all of the disincentives to self-identifying, alongside living with the re-traumatization of seeing so much identity fraud. And so in the report, there's a really close attention to thinking through what a process focused on meaningful consultations with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples would look like to arrive at a careful response specifically related to Métis, Indigenous, and First Nations peoples. So that's the first. The other aspect of the historical frame that has surrounded the work and that surrounds the recommendations on groups has been to recall the histories that have been forgotten. And so you will know that the employment equity discussion often starts with 1984 and the Abella Commission. And yet, Justice Abella herself recalls the importance of work on bilingualism and the understanding of group identities in the Canadian context, right? And so the first employment equity scheme, if you will, was for francophones in the federal civil service. There's an even longer history, and it's one that is only starting to come to light. I often cite Cecil Foster's work on porters who were specifically recruited as Black men from the United States, from the Maritimes, from the Caribbean, to basically replicate a tradition of segregation on the railway systems. And basically were part of a legalized segregation in Canada, right? Not its entirety, but one clear example of legal segregation, the strongest example being a 1939 Supreme Court of Canada decision, Christie v. York Tavern, in which legalized segregation was upheld by our Supreme Court of Canada on the eve of World War II. Why mention this? Because until we understand that the history of slavery and segregation isn't just a history for the US, that we weren't just the place that received the enslaved who were fleeing and seeking freedom, but that we also had enslaved who fled from Canada, we will not actually begin to understand the depth of the underrepresentation in our workplaces. We actively excluded Black workers, actively fought to create the human rights system that we have in place. And when we got our first human rights legislation, they said, this won't be enough. We need proactive measures to undo the harm that was caused by patterns of segregation, and even more importantly, by understandings that are stereotyped about the proper place of different categories of workers in the Canadian labor market. In other words, occupational segregation becomes or remains a reality even past the moment when the law no longer says this is the way things are meant to be. That's what we continue to live with. That's what we continue to live with. And then the statistics bear this out. So history matters. I could go on. Part of what we do in the report is talk about the purge as well in the federal public service that led to 2S LGBTQI+ peoples being forced out of the federal public service. Just last week, there was a commemoration installing a plaque to remember the importance of this moment, and the report repeats the lengthy apology that Prime Minister Trudeau put in place. But what remains and what motivated the recommendations that led to this historic announcement when the report was launched is the fear, all too real in this moment, of rollbacks. The fear of rollbacks, the fear of underrepresentation being not only continued but entrenched. And so the explanation for the various groups that are both proposed and retained lies in large measure in the history. And so, as you have probably followed, there has been an announcement now written into the April 2024 budget that changes from the report will be put into place in law. So 2 new designated groups, one for Black people, one for 2S LGBTQI+ people, and replacing of the language of Aboriginal peoples with a distinctions-based approach to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and ensuring consistency with UNDRIP, replacing the universally loathed language of visible minorities with that of racialized people, and updating the definition and aligning the definition of persons with disabilities with the Accessible Canada Act, and in that way making it more inclusive. And I cannot underscore the importance of that last change, more moving away from what I will discuss next, which is the deficit model that has surrounded the way that we think about barriers in employment equity towards one that moves us beyond. So you've seen this before, but this is a reminder then of the framework that is recommended through the report, implementation through barrier removal, meaningful consultation, and regulatory oversight as the framework to put in place to achieve and sustain employment equity. And you will see the previous slide focused on the groups, focused on some of the terminology, but I want to underscore the extent to which the report focuses on the systemic features, what actually needs to change if we are going to make having new categories, having new groups meaningful. So barrier removal, meaningful consultation, and regulatory oversight. And so the first barrier removal moves us beyond a deficit model. There are a number of ways in which I will try to explain why this move significantly changes the way that we've understood employment equity. So, do we continue the numerical focus? Absolutely. Right. We need to know what our demography looks like. We need to know what our goals are in particular workplaces, and we need to have the ability to achieve those goals. But rather than a purely bureaucratic approach to identifying the numbers, and I stress this because we spent so much time watching groups, watching employers, watching workplaces engage with how, is the underrepresentation 1.6 or 1.65, and not actually paying attention to retention, not actually paying attention to how equity deserving, to introduce the language of Principal and Vice President Wisdom Tete at University of Toronto, soon to be Carleton, why that language, why the group members themselves might be facing workplaces that are harmful, right? That are harmful to them, right? Might be leaving, might be getting lost. Our task force heard from so many groups and from so many people who came to us and said their work experiences have been a source of deep discouragement. They have not been promoted. They have not faced advancement in their careers. They've not had the opportunities to flourish. And the Employment Equity Act framework focus on reducing barriers is one that seeks to ensure that from the moment a person is being hired, from the recruitment process through to the promotions, through to the life cycles that people will go through, through to retirement, that there are measures in place that support them. And so this last, this barrier removal stage, and it's basically chapter 4 of the report, it's probably the longest chapter. And it takes us through a range of measures at each step of the employment life cycle and asks what needs to change, what might be changed in the workplace context. What would an actual scan of the workplace look like if we were taking group responsibilities or group needs into account throughout the process? It's probably also, it is the chapter with the fewest recommendations. And this is something I want to underscore as well. The employment equity reforms are in part ones that legislation can fix, but at another level, they are the kinds of actions that happen within the workplace context when we, in the workplace context, seek to make change. Simpler way of saying that is the change can happen in some measure without changes to the law, right? There's a real opportunity for changes in the workplace once it's understood that the crucial shift is away from focusing on what's wrong or different about the workers from historically marginalized groups. And instead, when the focus is placed on what's happening in the workplace. And let me illustrate this through the category that many might have said was benefiting the most from employment equity: women, right? So gender as a space where we were making progress, right? Women were being represented across the base in a range of employment equity categories. So took a look at the statistics. There are 516 unit groups of jobs in the most recent national occupational codes, almost a fifth. 98 occupations in 2021 remained over 90% men. Look at some of the examples, right? Railway carmen or women, drillers, blasters, industrial electricians, transport truck drivers. I mean, explain this, right? You're looking at largely well-paid positions. Very difficult to say that there's sociological reasons to explain why these positions would be underrepresented for women. Often people look and say, oh, transportation, women don't seek those positions. And yet, of course, if you're comparing an air pilot to a flight attendant, you get very similar occupational conditions, and it really is the jobs themselves. And so very high levels still of men in those positions, and a need then to look at what is actually happening in the jobs, what is actually happening in the workplace. Are we thinking about how to address harassment, for example, in workplaces when women enter into these positions? And so the report emphasizes the need to retain women as an employment equity group, and also then to ensure close attention to implementation of the workplace measures that help us to identify and remove the barriers in the context. Okay, thanks. Barrier removal distinctiveness, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to underscore that its rootedness is in substantive equality jurisprudence. Its rootedness is also in international law and how international law engages with substantive equality. We've come to employment equity as a framework that was devised to explain the difference between a vision of employment equity as reverse discrimination, the US context, and a vision of employment equity that says, oh no, it's not that model at all. It is a model that actually requires us to reverse discrimination, right? To actively engage in thinking about what it is in our legislation, in our frameworks, in our workplaces that prevents historically marginalized groups from attaining substantive equality in the workplace context. So a very different frame, a proactive frame that de-centers as well our focus on individual accommodations, our focus on thinking about the specific workplace changes that might be done to include one particular group, and rather to focus on the structural change. And our jurisprudence, some of the most important cases illustrate this well, and also speak to some of what you saw in the previous slide. A case that I like to emphasize is the Mayorin decision, literally a firefighter who was doing her job well, and then a test was introduced, and the test that was introduced was an anaerobic test that had been built on the basis of all men. And surprise, she didn't receive the score that would have allowed her to retain her job. And so her union grieved, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they said, wait a minute, this isn't an individual accommodation issue. This isn't about her. This is about the test itself, right? How do we think proactively, comprehensively to shift the frame, right? And we're seeing similar developments in occupational safety and health jurisprudence as well. So a transformative approach that helps us to remove barriers that then help us to rethink underrepresentation in occupations like the ones that you saw on the previous page. So The diversity is a fact. The inclusion is a choice. But the equity, in the Canadian context at least, is the law. And that is not just because we've got an Employment Equity Act, right? It's the law because of our substantive equality framework. It's the law because of our rootedness in international conventions and treaties. And so this barrier removal approach really anchors itself in that thicker understanding of what it means to be achieving substantive equality. Equity, in other words, is substantive equality. Okay, so in relation to this, and there's a full chapter focusing on the data piece, the reframing to achieve the barrier removal is through understanding the human rights purpose of collecting equity data, right? We know that data collection has been used against equity groups in some contexts and some occasions. And there's been concern in many of the communities covered by the employment equity legislation about the why, about data sovereignty in particular in relation to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And much of the data we tried to rely on in the report came from Indigenous communities seeking to not only collect, but also present the data in ways that are responsive to community understandings of who they are and what they're engaged with and what their aspirations are. And so the innovations in particular in the BC context on collecting race-based data were deeply influential, and the emphasis on the grandmother principle, right, which is in large measure a do no harm approach to thinking about data, surrounded this work. And once we were able to frame why data matters to the human rights purpose, we could also then work through some of the clear challenges, the clear tensions that surrounded the way in which we were engaging with privacy law frameworks, right? So thinking about privacy law less in oppositional terms, less in terms of, in other words, the shield to achieving equity, rather thinking about the fundamental character of both and how they can be mutually enhancing in the way that we think about employment equity. The other aspect to the data dimensions was then how thinking differently about why we were collecting the data would it help us to identify some of the key problems or challenges that emerged out of employment equity practices. What am I talking about? Well, the way that we collect some of the data on underrepresented groups actually underscored or reinforced or embedded some of the discrimination. Take the quintessential example of the taxi driver who happens to have a PhD, the taxi driver who is clearly underemployed. If we're looking at that person and counting them as a taxi driver, we're reinforcing the underrepresentation. If we're not actually thinking about the ways in which their experiences and skills have been undervalued, we're replicating the problem. And so much of the work in the report was addressed to that. And I have to say, on the data dimension, the way in which universities, through the tri-agencies handling or management of the CRC program, have moved towards a population-based approach to data management and to assessing attainment rates, that was crucial. Also to recommending that the government move beyond the way that it's currently calculating representation, which is a more restrictive test than the rest, towards a broader approach that would bring us from labor market availability to enabling employment equity to move us towards a more closely monitoring or achieving population-based results. Okay. Second pillar, and I'm going to speed it up a little bit because I want to make sure that we have time for comments and questions. Second pillar, nothing about us without us, is the fast way of saying what this is meant to be about. So it's a meaningful consultations pillar. There's some nods to meaningful consultations in the Employment Equity Act already, but they've been completely flattened out. And what we've wound up with is an approach to employment equity that has been really top down. Okay. The framework is designed to be a framework that involves engaging not only with data as quantitative, but data as lived experience, data as qualitative, as engaging with people who know what they can contribute to the workplace and are asking to have that opportunity to contribute. And so the framework that we drew upon was a framework that some workplaces have already put in place voluntarily, and that's joint employment equity committees as a mandated piece of the framework, where you get over the challenge that we repeatedly heard, where groups said, we are tired of being consulted all the time, yet we really want to be consulted, right? Meaningfully consulted, not in the top-down survey here, testimony there, but actual frameworks that allow actors in the workplace to meet with appropriate information, with confidentiality protections, to stimulate looking at employment equity plans, building those plans, implementing those plans. Okay, so this, although it builds on case law as well, I won't turn to that here, but the key is that the proposal mirrors what's already underway in many federal workplaces, pay equity committees, occupational safety and health committees, but with real attention to representation. So the third and final pillar is regulatory oversight. And the pillar emphasizes both the challenges in the administration of employment equity, and the report discusses this at length, but let me just say, if you've got 11 people in the federal civil service auditing the entire federal civil service, private sector, public sector, you got a problem, right? And I realized going through the audits that I was one of the only people outside of the Human Rights Commission responsible for auditing to ever have seen the audits beyond the occasional employers who had seen them. There's a real system breakdown. There was also a broad range of measures that were being covered and not much coherence in terms of what actually needs to be focused on in order to make regulatory compliance proactive and effective. And so, drawing on the recommendation of many groups, we encouraged, recommended an employment equity commissioner be established to put in place the measures, and have also recommended a broad range of measures at each step of the way to support achieving and sustaining employment equity, including harmonizing the enforcement framework with the pay equity framework, with the occupational safety and health framework. Okay, so higher education. What's our responsibility here? How can our sector lead and support achieving and sustaining employment equity? And a catalyst for change was learning from the federal and research funding agencies. We heard repeatedly that an agency that's able to catalyze change is crucial. And the implementation of the CRC process program when the equity addenda was also helpful to our reflections on this oversight. And we noted, of course, this is not an initiative that happened fully voluntarily. The court settlements, however, were visionary, and the way in which some universities, including your own, have worked with some of the measures through the CRC implementation process to broaden those to broader recruitment practices has been crucial. And so the report urges that these reasons for implementation not be overlooked in any proposed redesign of the federal funding landscape. And so in the next slide, I, thanks, want to underscore what I heard from you. And so in a report to our task force, you offered and turned your attention very particularly to the federal contractors program, of which Queens is a member, and the program and plan that you put in place, as well as the analyses, the numerical goals, and the reasonable progress that you illustrate, that you make. And you recommended that the employment equity programs should apply for federal funding. In other words, the incentive frame that's in place, and that should be broadly available. And so in the recommendations, namely recommendation 714, our task force concluded that after surveying the federal landscape, after listening to representations, including by the Canadian Association of University Teachers, that colleges and universities should be required to agree to participate in the federal contractors program to be eligible to apply for federal research grants and other federal research funding, and to participate in federal research granting councils, including, with reference to the Bouchard Commission's recommendations, the Canadian Knowledge and Science Foundation. And this will create a landscape that is then even across the university and college sector, and allows an opportunity to determine across the board how our sector leads, right? How our sector takes this very specific responsibility to heart to achieve and sustain employment equity. The timing is apposite precisely because of the Bouchard Commission's work on which proposed a Canadian Knowledge and Science Foundation. It's a recommendation that's designed to foster clarity, consistency, transparency, as researchers themselves will know that their employer is part of the program, the federal contractors program, and will be able to assess across the board how it is doing in promoting employment equity across the board. We've already seen our sector moving forward in relation to a specific aspect of leadership. So through the Scarborough Charter and the task force received representations on the Scarborough Charter in terms of the importance that notions like Black flourishing, one of the 4 principles in the Scarborough Charter context, has on thinking about what it is that we're trying to accomplish through the employment equity framework. In other words, again, beyond the deficit model, but towards a model that really seeks to reimagine the claim, reimagine the importance of the work that's being done. One of the things I did not mention, but that surrounds the report's discussion of barriers as well, is that we looked at barriers, of course, within the workplace, but also the kinds of barriers that surround the workplace context. And of course, education just kept coming up. Right? How are we doing in terms of creating the opportunities that workforces can draw upon? And the Scarborough Charter speaks to that broader framework of inclusion, that broader framework of how you build access to the various professions, to the various workplace contexts. And so the 4 principles in the Scarborough Charter are Black flourishing and understood in an intersectional sense, inclusive excellence, accountability, and mutuality. And the first 3 that I've mentioned are generally kind of understood in the context of a university. I was particularly struck by your principles reflections in the Queen's Alumni magazine on mutuality and the challenge that mutuality offers within a university context. And that is the challenge of understanding in a context that is tended to be thought of as fairly individualistic, fairly focused on individual achievement, on how we think about a notion that calls on us basically to be in relation with each other, to be in relation with our communities. I was struck in particular by his emphasis on moving forward with modesty in relation to this. If we're understanding universities and colleges as embedded in communities locally, as well as nationally, regionally, and internationally, if we're focused on the interactive relationship with those communities, then you're thinking differently about the referentiality, the self-sufficiency of the Western Academy. So why mention that here in relation to employment equity? Why have that reflection in this context? And well, we're coming in relation to thinking about universities' responsibility on employment equity is a deeper self-realization of the pivotal role that institutions that educate, provide space for reflection, for debate, for discussion, for entering into relationship in our society. We're really thinking about how it is that we reflect our communities. Universities less as an ivory tower and more as a microcosm, right? Universities as presenting, dare I say, our best selves to ourselves and to our communities. Learning from our communities, being part of our communities, being part of processes that allow us to understand, engage with our histories, and build the kind of world that we want to be able to live in. There's a fierce urgency to this now. I don't need to speak to the extent of the challenge that our universities are facing in precisely a moment as this. In this challenge, there's also, I would suggest, a deep opportunity, an opportunity to say something meaningful about the kinds of commitments that we can make to building places, building spaces where we come to see ourselves, where we have the opportunity to sit and learn from all of us, where we can literally enter a space and know that the one and the many, the composite realities where we all belong. So I will end there, and thank you very much for the work that you're doing to make that vision a reality.